For the last 6 months, I've been developing a course for my Patreon students called Anatomy for Portrait Artists. It's an in-depth guide to everything you need to know about anatomy in order to become a highly proficient portrait artist. And it includes exercises that are designed to help you get the practice that you need for that knowledge to make its way into your artwork. The clips that you're going to see in this video are taken from a practical lesson on understanding these simplified forms of the skull that you can use to make your portrait block-ins that much better. What this exercise is designed to do is help you gain a better three-dimensional understanding of the fundamental planes of the head, so that when you're drawing or painting a portrait, you're not just copying flat shapes, you're understanding the depth and atmosphere around your model. If you want to dive deeper and work along with this lesson and get access to my anatomy lectures and other practical lessons, all you got to do is go to my Patreon page. There's a link in the description of this video, and subscribe to the Atelier tier. Once you've done that, all that's left to do is watch, work along, and get better at portrait drawing.
In this case, that's going to mean quite rapid studies of the skull made by looking at the skull from different positions so that we are able to assimilate and understand even better the relationships between the major anatomical features of the skull in 3 dimensions. My anatomy teacher from when I started studying about 100 years ago referred to this as being able to tumble the forms in your head. The drawings themselves are going to be done quite rapidly and aren't going to involve almost any value whatsoever. Just like literally any other drawing that I start, I'm going to begin by establishing the basic proportions. As this is a 3/4 left-facing head, I think that establishing the top, bottom, left and right should look something like this. Remember that the template we're working with has just a few key features to it, one of which is the zygomatic arch. If I take a look at the overall height of the skull here, I look for where that zygomatic arch is placed, I'll say that it's just below the empirical center of this height. I also know that that zygomatic arch represents the lateral edge of the front plane of the face. I can also find the relationship in between the beginning of that arch on the left and right side and start to describe the bottom of that shield-shaped front plane of the head. Let's go ahead and bring up the side of the skull here just before I indicate where the vertical center line should be. That, of course, culminates at the center of the bottom of the chin. And it can also tell me a little bit about some of the spaces that I'm creating with these generic lines. So let's just say this is the beginning of my head structure template. And we'll see now by taking measurements if it bears any relationship to the skull that I'm drawing from. I think that eventually the height of the zygomatic arch is a little bit lower. I'm going to give it an indication of 2 lines here, one at the top and one at the bottom of it. And I think the back edge of the jaw ends a little bit sooner in this view. We want this line to start at the widest point of the face and culminate at the widest point of the jaw. I think that I need to increase the angle here. That means also changing a little bit the angle of the mandible. Now remember, this particular plane shift here should be taking place roughly along the edge of the forehead, right about where the temporal line descends down towards the front of the skull. And that temporal line tapers out as we head towards the occipital bone. The mastoid process in this case, as in all cases really, wants to end well below where the external auditory meatus would be. Now remember, that is the ear hole, and that sits just at the posterior edge of the zygomatic arch where it lands on the parietal bone. So just here we have the external auditory meatus. Below that should be the mastoid process, which kind of represents the bottommost edge at the back of the skull. Don't be afraid to take this position here, right in the center of the face, which essentially is the bottom of the nasal bone, and use that as a moment to kind of break the angle slightly of that vertical center line, which as we come down to the bottom of the skull, almost comes to the very edge of the mandible on that right-hand side. Now in between the frontal eminences, of course, we have that high point, what we consider the forehead. Need to adjust a little bit this boundary here to reflect better the 3/4 turn of the head. And that means also adjusting a little bit the top of the head. Try to remember that the point here is not to make a perfect drawing. Really, it's to internalize how this structure looks from a variety of positions. In addition to that, however, some of the other skills that you can practice here are your control over your line weight and your line quality. So you should look for lines that are all relatively the same value and also relatively of a similar width, so that we don't have some lines that are super thick and super dark and others that are really thin and sort of wavy like this. We'd like all our lines to be straight. We'd like them to be of a relatively even value and also of a relatively even width. Let's move on to the next pose. Once again, I'm going to start with the top and bottom proportions of the model. Should be relatively similar to the ones that I have in my previous sketch here on the left. And then to also configure the far left and far right hand sides of the pose. In this pose, we're pretty much in between a 3/4 turn to the right and a full profile view. So we're going to have a very slim view of the far right hand side of the face, meaning that that vertical center line is going to be very far towards the edge. In addition to that, we're looking a bit up at the skull. And that's going to change some of the relationships, like the location of the external auditory meatus and the zygomatic arch. I think that the height of the zygomatic arch in this case is just about dead center in between the top and bottom of the pose. And the turning edge between the front plane of the face and the side plane of the head is just right of center. Also, the relationship in between the zygomatic bones on the right and left is tilted downward on the right. You can see a very subtle hint here into how perspective plays a role in this kind of drawing. Remember that those two lines of orientation on this pose on the left, where we were looking down on the skull, form a V shape. Whereas here, looking up at the skull, we have an inverted V shape. Just something interesting to know, if not totally consequential in the drawing. Essentially, what we're drawing is a quite complex cube, which to my mind maybe makes it a little bit less intimidating. Something else that's interesting, when we look at this uppermost point of the forehead, right, in between the frontal eminences, it's going to be quite a bit higher on this pose because we are looking up at the skull, and so the top of the skull is a little bit more foreshortened. Now, at the posterior edge of the zygomatic arch, I'm looking at that as being maybe at the back third of the overall proportions of the skull here. And that, of course, is where I'm going to indicate the back edge of the mandible. We're also, in this case, going to see, in fact, below the mastoid process, we're actually seeing the bottom edge of the skull on the far right-hand side. So I'm going to make a little bit of a kind of ellipse here to indicate that we're looking up a bit on this section of the skull. Now, my initial assessment here is that I bet this blocking is going to have a lot of things to change. If that is the case when you're drawing this, please, please, please do not take it as something discouraging. In fact, the whole point of this is so that you can learn the kind of proportional mistakes that you make and just gain experience and mileage. Remember that it took us about 10 or 15 minutes to make this head. It's going to take us about 10 or 15 to make this. Ideally, we're going to do dozens of these until you get a really solid grasp of what that complicated cube of the skull looks like tumbling in 3D space. Taking some comparisons, I think I did a decent job with the top and front of the skull. And I was pretty close with the orientation of my vertical center line. I just want to move it back a little bit. In fact, I think once we get past this point, I'm not sure that we really see any of the skull past that high point on the forehead here. Remember also that these points along either side should have a correlating relationship in the tilt that they exhibit from one side to the other. Now, I keep describing this as a fast and easy project. Let's take into account that if you haven't drawn many of these heads, it's going to be a challenge, and maybe your first several are not going to be very good. However, I want you to recall that what you're gaining here is not at all a drawing, but an experience, and that no matter how average or not great your drawing is, your experience of drawing it is invaluable to your future drawings. So just try to keep your future self in mind, and remember that that person is going to be thanking you for the time that you spend drawing really average looking skull template block-ins.
Thank you so much for watching this lesson about how to create a simplified block-in of the human skull. If you want to get the full lesson, remember the link in the description of this video takes you right to my Patreon page, where you'll get access to this lesson and dozens of others that are designed to do nothing more except help you get better at portraiture. Once again, I'm Stephen Bauman, and I will see you in the next video.